Bill, I think you joined the BBC just 1 year after I did in 1970 and spent
Yes.
most of your time as a sound recordist, as a sound supervisor, particularly with very high quality sound. Tell me how it all started initially.
I had a friend who joined the BBC as a cameraman, camera assistant. He used to come over to my bedsit, where I had an extra bed, when he was doing things like 3 day plays, and he didn't want to drive all the way back to his folks' place, where he was staying in Berkshire somewhere. And as a sort of thank you for putting him up like that, he used to get me tickets to go and see various shows, mainly LE shows, of course, at the Telly Centre. And I used to go to these shows and sit there with my mouth open going, this is exactly what I want to do. And I very occasionally I used to go down to his folks' place and they'd feed me up at the weekend and do my washing and all that sort of stuff. And I'd sit there moaning about, oh, Graham's got a really good job and I wish I had his job and so on and so forth. Because I was working in a bank and I wasn't enjoying it much. And his mother eventually got fed up with me moaning away. And she said, for goodness sakes, you write a letter to the BBC, I'll type it out for you and we'll send it off. And months later, I got a reply saying, you will attend an interview in Cavendish Square, which I went along to. Another 3 months went by, and eventually I got a letter saying, Mr. Whiston, you will attend the BBC training department at Wood Norton.
Right.
They seem to think that I was sort of fresh out of school or something, rather than working.
So you went to Wood Norton, as all engineers, potential engineers. What were your qualifications?
My A levels were abysmal. When I was at school, I actually discovered girls and guitars at the wrong time, and basically I got two miserable passes in A levels. One was physics and the other was French, which didn't really help because my intention was actually to be an anaesthetist. Well, chemistry was nowhere. So when I came across from Kenya, I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. But I managed to get a job in Romford at North Thames Gas Board, and that sort of moved on to the bank. And then, luckily, the bank moved on to the glorious BBC.
Right. But had you had an interest in music or in sound before you joined the BBC?
Yes, when I was in Kenya, I ran a little pop group, and I met up with an American guy whose dad had an Akai M9 tape machine, and I discovered how to multi-track on it. And I was also being in the sort of quotes business of being in a group, friendly with other people in other groups, and persuaded them to come round and record them. So that was a sort of starter. And music's always been part of my life anyway, and it just sort of went from there. I'd always had that interest. I was also interested in photography, so the Beeb sort of thought that was a good thing.
Okay. So you turned up at Wood Norton. How do they train you? What do they do?
Well, it was a 3 month course, and basically they taught us the basics of the stuff that we were supposed to know, safety and how things worked, and a lot of hands-on stuff. Eventually, on the third month, sort of actually making programs. I mean, I thought it was a brilliant course because it taught me all sorts of things that I didn't know about. It was a general overall course, but some of the people on my course were going, or intended to go, to radio. Some of them were going to transmitters, and some of them were like me and going to, although not many actually, come to think of it, were on their way to television centre.
But were you taught how to place microphones,
Yep.
how to actually record things, and how to edit them, and so on?
Yes, fairly basic stuff.
Yeah.
When it comes to editing, but yes, all the stuff about how microphones worked and sound desks worked and all that sort of very basic stuff, and some of the what you do in studios and stuff like that. But when I actually left and went to studios, was introduced to my first crew, I was told almost immediately that whatever you so-called learnt at Wood Norton, you can now forget, because this is where you start learning.
Oh, right.
I thought it was a bit unfair to the guys up in Wood Norton because they were very good, but I sort of understood what they meant in actual fact, because that was the nitty-gritty, if you like, of actually learning the trade, if you like, to put it that way.
Were you on the floor or in the gallery?
No, definitely on the floor. Galleries were sort of almost no go, not quite. I mean, you could go upstairs and watch people doing things like gram ops and the sound supervisors and stuff like that. I loved it because it was my first crew was Crew 11, and it was doing Top of the Pops. And guess what? I love pop music, so I was in my element basically.
So give us because I mean, Top of the Pops was notorious for all sorts of things. But give me an idea about what the atmosphere was like and what you were actually doing on the floor.
Well, I was rigging microphones and setting up stages and stuff like that. Yeah. Top of the Pops was pretty much live, so groups used to come in and actually play, and we had an orchestra, and basically we just learned the craft of. Oh, that was one of the things we had to do for those that had backing tracks that they sang to, because they used to do live vocals but backing tracks quite often. Had to push a large LS10 loudspeaker around the floor as a fallback speaker, and that was something that was nearly as big as I was, and also not getting in the way of people dancing, which is Top of the Pops was famous for.
So tell me how that works, because you don't want the backing track to sort of become too prominent in the live sound from the singer, surely.
Well, no, I mean they sing quite close to the microphone, being pop people, and basically you have it on just loud enough for them to be happy with what they're singing against, and it all happens upstairs. The sound supervisor just puts it together with the backing track that's been played, and it works very well. You soon get told if the fallback's too loud from upstairs, so you generally get the idea of what's going on and get used to it. We obviously did programmes as a crew, not just Top of the Pops. We did other programmes, and I was eventually introduced to doing Fisher Booms. My first ever programme doing a Fisher Boom was a set that was made of a jungle, basically, and there were 2 or 3 soldiers stranded in it, trying to work their way out. And there were a couple of cameras in front of me, and what I didn't realise, there was one that had snuck round the side. And every now and then when they cut to it, I happened to be in shot, and I couldn't work out where this camera was and why I was in shot all the time. Eventually I did work it out, but I thought it was a bit sneaky to... A fresh young lad on a boom, couldn't really work out what was going on. But we soon worked it out. I mean, I think in a way it was a way of teaching me to work out stuff quickly. It did take me a few minutes, I have to say, but once I got the hang of it, I realised what was going on.
Now, these booms, why did they use booms then? Presumably because they've sort of given up using them, really, haven't they now?
Pretty much, because people tend to use radio mics. Sometimes they work well and sometimes they're, I suppose, abysmal is a word. It all depends where they end up. Fisher Booms were a great way of covering 2, 3 people, 4, 5, 6 people even, if you needed to. You could swing between bits and bods. You could track if you needed to. Go sideways, be pushed sideways if you needed to, all sorts of, it was a very mobile thing, so long as you had somebody pushing it who knew what they were doing and sort of understood exactly what the process was.
So this was fairly directional microphone you swung around, yeah.
Well, you could swing fairly fast, but occasionally wind noise prevented it.
And you had to keep out of the shot, presumably.
That's right, yeah, and shadows, of course.
Yes. The famous boom shadows, yes, absolutely.
Indeed.
So you're working in the studio floor at Television Centre. Exciting stuff.
It was well produced, shall we say? There were floor managers, sort of guiding the dancing folk, the audience, if you like, guiding them around and making sure that the mobile cranes for the cameras didn't run them over and they didn't get in the way of shots and stuff like that. And we sort of snuck, as I said, tracking speakers and stuff like that between them and getting between sets. There were usually 3 sets in the studio that you sort of had to move between if you were pushing a loudspeaker. And it was done as live. Occasionally used to do pickups and stuff like that if something went wrong. But basically it was pretty much as live. Well, we all know about the Jimi Hendrix thing where it was live and the grandma played the wrong backing track to him and he stood there and said, "I don't know this song, man."
I don't remember that. Oh, that's very funny.
Oh yeah, that happened.
Red Faces Upstairs, yes.
Pretty much.
Yeah. But you were in your element for that because you liked pop music and so on.
Oh, I loved it.
What other studio things were memorable at that time before you moved? I think you moved shortly. Well, perhaps it was not shortly. Perhaps it was about sort of 8 years later into OBs. Is that right?
I actually had 2 attachments to OBs in 1976 and 77. I really loved going there and doing the work. As an attachee, you were there to help out, doing things like walking golf course fairways with a directional microphone to get people hitting balls or talking or whatever, and lots of other bits and pieces that I was generally there to be useful for. Wimbledon. In fact, Wimbledon, I did every single Wimbledon from my first attachment all the way through to when I actually stopped working, when I retired. Apart from the very last year when Sis, who took over from BBC Outside Broadcast, lost the contract. So I lost my Wimbledon. I did centre court for years and years and years.
To go back in the early days when you first started at Wimbledon, I know that the sound coverage of Wimbledon got more and more sophisticated. But when you started off, what were you doing? I mean, how many microphones do you have around a tennis match, for example?
Not many. There were 2 on the chair. You had a feed of the umpire's mic, and being mono, of course, you had a mic fixed sort of up in the gods to cover audiences, applause and stuff like that. I'm afraid I'm the guilty one as far as that infamous McEnroe match, which was in the old number 1 court.
Yes.
And he was playing a guy called Tom Gullickson, and one of his shots was called out. And as it so happened, I was actually doing the mix in that court at that time. I was sort of standing in because somebody else had gone off for tea or something like that. And I wasn't a sound supervisor at all. I was just an oik sitting in there doing what I was doing. By this time I'd actually joined OB, so I was on a crew.
Yes.
Well, when McEnroe started off, I thought, people actually want to hear this. What you had to do, in actual fact, if there was a dispute on the court, you were supposed to go to the audience mic and lose the microphone stuck on the chair, the actual court mics.
Yes.
Well, he started off, and of course, I had them up, not expecting anything to happen like that. And I thought, people will want to hear this, because this is an argument between him and the umpire. So I'm afraid I kept it up. So everybody heard, you can't be serious, or whatever it was. So
you cannot be serious, I think it was like that.
You cannot be serious, yes. And the general carry on. And once it was up, it was up. Nobody ever told me off for doing it. In actual fact, as I remember...
Well, it probably made the news, did it? I don't know.
Well, it certainly did, yeah. I don't think to this day he knows it was me. But
he will now.
He will now, perhaps, if he gets hold of this.
When did stereo start on television? Because it had been... stereo had been around on radio for quite some time.
Do you know, I really can't remember why or how, but it sort of happened and we all started doing it. I was more involved with surround sound when that came in.
That's a good deal later, though, presumably.
It was a good deal later,
Yeah.
yes.
So stereo didn't really have much effect, did it, in terms of how you covered things,
It
or
it
did
it
it?
did, because the outside courts were still mono when we were doing stereo on centre court and number one court. So it was a gradual process. I know I was involved in making it stereo. That was centre court, because by then I was sort of actually doing centre court.
Yeah.
I'd done the outside courts for some time, and stereo came in during that time. It's really strange. I can't remember the exact date it sort of came in.
But in those days, television sets largely only had one mic, one loudspeaker, didn't they? So I suppose it was sort of chicken and egg thing. What happened? Whereas people had stereo, sound systems and so on, but not televisions.
Yes, that's right. But that eventually changed, obviously, and obviously we thought it was good to start doing stereo,
Yeah.
and I was more than happy to do that. And certainly, eventually the outside courts mix also went stereo.
Okay, if you're part of an OB crew, how many people would be there for sound? I mean, let's say Wimbledon for the moment. Would you have people manning microphones at different points, or would they be fixed microphones?
They'd all be fixed microphones,
Right.
apart from the interviews and stuff like that out on
Yeah.
the courts and stuff like that. But basically, you had your commentators. There could be up to 3 commentators on the big matches, the finals, maybe even the semi-finals. Well, I ended up with quite a lot of mics on the court. A stereo overall mic, which obviously looked at the court. You'd then have 2 microphones on the chair pointing either end, to basically catch the serves. I put a stereo mic at the back of the court pointing down into the court from that end, and reverse the polarity of it, so that anybody running left to right down that end would move the right way. And then behind the main mic, the near side of the court, I had 2 microphones looking into the near crowd, if you like, and then one up in the gods to get an overall of the complete court.
Yeah.
And a couple of mics on the 2 low cameras that were on the sides, by the chair.
And you'd be mixing these, would you? Were you actually?
Yeah.
You were actually in charge of mixing the things
Oh, yes.
at that point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. So that made you a fully fledged sound supervisor.
Oh, I was a fully fledged sound supervisor by then. Yes, that happened in '84. I got my job, sound supervisor's job. But before then, I'd done quite a lot of outside court stuff and mono centre court.
But you were also doing other things. I mean, the boat race. That would have been interesting because you had a lot of presumably radio mics and everything else there.
I tended not to do the main site of the boats. I used to be sort of down the course, doing effects sort of into these single camera units or small units that were down the course. So that was just sort of general atmosphere and trying, if possible, to get splashes from the boats. But they were and picking up radio mic stuff as well, of course, on the course.
What about horse racing? Because you've got mobile cameras and presumably mobile sound as well.
Yes, yeah. That was all done on. You had a camera on a converted Citroen, which dashed off down the road. It for ages it never had a microphone on it. It was just you possibly had somebody with a radio mic transmitter walking over there with an 816 microphone stuck into it, trying to pick up whatever. Usually they started off looking at the horses getting into the stalls, being taken in there by the guys running the stalls. And then before the race actually set off, they might move position to one of the interesting fences if it was a steeplechase, or maybe stay there for the start if it was a flat race.
But during the race, you're picking up, horses galloping as they shoot across the screen. So presumably you had to have. Did you not have microphones on the Citroen?
No.
No, you didn't.
Not for ages.
Right.
We did eventually, but it was a mono mic, and only for you never used that for when the car was running along beside the horses.
Because it was making too much noise itself, I suppose.
Yes, and also, fluffed as it might be, a lot of wind noise and stuff like that, possibly, which it didn't want. The horses hooves was a slowed down buffalo charge off tape. Yes.
Ooh, secrets are being revealed.
Yes, secrets. Yes. Quite famously, if you were doing a steeplechase, it was quite fun because as they cut to a camera looking at a steeplechase, you could sort of make horse hooves come and go. And of course you had microphones on each jump, so you could hear the horses actually galloping properly and hitting the fence and falling over maybe or whatever. Yes. But you still had horses running around them, so you did a mix between what the microphone at the jump was picking up, horses landing and stuff like that, plus the sound of your tape of horses still galloping somewhere.
Buffaloes charging around. Good
Buffaloes
Lord,
charging.
That's a revelation. Good, interesting. Presumably you were using, though, depending on what you were doing, microphones with enormous sensitivity and very directional, so that you could point them in exactly at something which was quite a long way away and get some reasonable sound. Is that so?
Yeah, the Sennheisers, the 816 and the 416 were our standard sort of microphones for covering any sort of activity in sport. It was very seldom we used anything else, to be honest. Very occasionally you might use an Omni mic dropped somewhere convenient to pick up something.
Yeah.
But by and large, it was 4 and 6s if you were probably inside or in somewhere like a tennis court. Maybe an 816 out on rugby matches, football matches, horse racing, whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what about music? You had this love of music, but were you doing any OBs with music?
Oh, loads. My very first OB on my first attachment, I went all the way up to Scarborough to do Seaside Special, and it was great. I loved it. We did have a band of sorts, but it was mostly tape playback for the acts that we had, but a big audience rig, of course, and that was just so much fun to do. It may have been tape playback, but they were singing live.
Yes.
To what you were producing, a bit like Top of the Pops.
Mm-hmm.
So that was great fun. And having done the first one in Scarborough, we then travelled across to Blackpool and did the same there. So they were my two first programmes in OBs, and I thought this is absolutely great. And then for the rest of that year, well, it was just a season really, summer standing in for as an extra from television studios, and I got, of course it was 76, so I got very brown walking fairways for the golf and doing various other bits and pieces, a bit of football, and then came back to Telly Centre, and the first thing I did when I got back was go and see our sound manager to ask if I could go back to OBs the next year, and I was told that there was probably a waiting list for people going back to OBs, so there was no guarantee that you were going to go back, and really you'd just been, so you shouldn't really go back again. But luckily, well, I was a bit persistent, I have to say.
Yeah.
So I did actually go back the next year, and exactly the same, golf and lots of odd bits in football, and it was just great.
You were never tempted to go and work with film department as a sound recordist on film locations.
No, they were a very different department. I did go there on attachment, hardly the word. I went there when I was very new as part of the circus. When you came from Wood Norton as a trainee, you were sent to various places to have a go on a sort of tour of all the bits and pieces of the BBC television, and film was one. And yeah, they've well, I hope they don't mind me saying, but I found it a bit of a strange place.
The culture
Yes,
and
yes.
and being on the road with a small crew, very different from an OB.
Well, I never went on the road. I was never allowed to. I just sort of mooched around trying to find things to do, and sat in on a dubbing session. But really, I was sort of given double enders to clean up and stuff like that, which really wasn't much cop as far as learning about film. So I went back to Telecentre and carried on doing that. And so I was attached to cameras for a while. I was totally useless at that. I never wanted to be a cameraman. I always wanted to be a sound man. And I was always slightly miffed that it was expected that I should do cameras, and expected to be very good at cameras. And I was useless. I really was.
Interesting.
So I was actually told by the gentleman who was in charge of us trainees that I would have another month on cameras, and if I didn't improve, I'd probably not have a job anymore.
Crumbs.
So I went back and did my month, and I was just as useless. And I went back and saw this gentleman for an interview, and he said, "The policy's changed. We won't be getting rid of you. And you appear to want to go to sound, so we'll put you on sound." Glory be, as they say.
Right. Now let's move forward a bit to sort of more modern
Yeah.
sound technology, because you've become very interested in surround sound
Yes.
and so on. And I think an awful lot of people don't really quite understand it, because it uses special kit that's domestically you've got to get a lot of loudspeakers and what have you. But tell me how surround sound came in, and what it gives you that other sound doesn't.
Well, it puts you in the middle of everything if it's done correctly. Concerts in, say, the Albert Hall sound like you're there. If you're doing Wimbledon, you're in the crowd, watching players play in front of you, and you have the atmosphere of the crowd, which is sometimes electric.
It's all around you. Yes.
Yeah, so it's quite exciting as a thing to do, and it's just involving. It gets people involved in things. I got into it. I was doing a play called Sloggers for children's television, a series, and the producer stroke director of that was Albert Barber, and
Yes.
we got talking, and I was telling him how interested I was in surround sound, and I must have sold it to him, because he said, "Could we do Sloggers in surround?" And I said, "Well, we can try, and it's obviously got to be recorded in mono, because nobody's doing surround. Stereo was sort of going, but not surround, obviously." So I said, "Well, if we want to do it, I'll have to ask if I can." So I went to my then boss and said, "I've got somebody who wants to do surround." And he said, "You can't." And I said, why? And he said, well, surround means Dolby, and we don't use Dolby, so you can't do it. So I had to go back to Albert. And I racked my brains thinking, how the hell can I do this for Albert? Because I really wanted to do it.
Yes.
And at the time I was sort of looking after the equipment in OBs and going through the stores to see what was there and make a list of what we had. And I discovered a Dolby Pro unit, and lo and behold, I found a way of doing surround. A ProLogic encoder decoder was in stores.
You better explain what this Dolby equipment was like.
Right, well, it's just a 1U box for the encoder and the decoder, and you feed the bits that you want to make up your front and back into it, and it's not the Pro version, it's a sort of semi-Pro version before proper Dolby came out, and it was slightly odd in that if it got too much noise coming in the front, it would steer it off to the right hand side, so you had to be careful what you put into it.
This was 5.1, was it?
Yes.
What they call 5.1 stereo.
That's right. So it's 5.1 surround. I worked out that if I went to Wimbledon and plugged in the crowd as a surround, but just left the commentators and the court effects going, I could actually make up a reasonable surround sound without anybody knowing about it, because it wasn't as we now have Dolby. It was encoded as stereo, so anyone looking at it would just listen to a stereo program, but it was put into a decoder. Out would come surround. So I got away with it for quite a long time, and I could practice and work out and test and do all sorts of things on a court, putting extra microphones in and twirling around and doing this, that and the other, without anyone else knowing that I was doing it.
But how were people able to hear this? Was presumably very few people who could actually listen to this surround sound.
If they had
stuff.
a ProLogic decoder, they would actually discover that there was surround going on, and they would only have that if they were interested in surround sound. So basically, to anyone who was actually listening to Wimbledon, it was just ordinary stereo. But I had colleagues that would go home and they had ProLogic decoders, and they'd listen at home and come back and tell me what the result was at home, having transmitted it. So we sort of worked through that. And eventually I was discovered doing it, or came clean, or one of those. And I gave a lecture to the IBC a little while later. And I had two Australians come up, Australian sound supervisors, who came up to me and said, "We've liked your surround sound for years. We've been listening to what you've been doing." And so they just purely happened to have decoders in their system at home in Australia, and had picked it up and could hear what I was doing.
It's now pretty much everywhere, isn't it?
It is. Well, what happened then was that Dolby heard about it. They got hold of me and said, "We know you're using ProLogic, but would you like to do a proper Dolby mix for us to use as a demo?" So I went down to their place in the West Country and spent a few days mixing a proper Dolby mix, which then was touted around the world for all to learn how to do, basically. Having done all my experiments at Wimbledon, and then eventually got the BBC interested in actually doing surround, because surround was part of the spec for high definition television.
Yes.
Basically, I got very involved in persuading the BBC to do it, and we had some high-end meetings at Telecentre and various places about it. It was a real struggle to get surround sound done. The management in CAR, shall we say,
Yes.
were very, very anti. They really didn't want to know. And I was told by one gentleman that if I wanted to connect up the BT line that would be taking our stuff from Wimbledon into the central area, I would have to come along and bang a hole through the wall and put it in myself, because they were really not interested in doing it.
Really?
So that was at the level of stuff that I had to sort of work against. But luckily I had people on my side. So we got it done anyway.
Right. So the technology improved, and eventually the BBC
Yes.
were forced to do it, if you like.
They were persuaded to do it.
Yeah, they were persuaded to do it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, what percentage of the output now is in surround sound?
Well, it's available on, certainly when we started off, football, and most of the ball sports, if you like, the rugby and stuff like that, and a bit of golf and stuff like that were done in surround. The proms eventually started in 2006, and luckily I was mixing proms in those days, so I actually got to so that's where it all started.
Okay. But this was still 5.1
Yes.
surround. There is
Yes.
7.1, but also when you came on to your work with more recently with super high definition, I mean, you were up to 22 channels.
I actually did a 22.2 surround mix for NHK. We were based on what I call Boris's Beehive, the Mayor of London's place on the South
yes.
Bank. NHK wanted to prove that they could put 22.2 down the line to Amsterdam and decode it and produce a very much involving mix, height as well as left, right and backwards. So we did that for them. Why?
Was this for IBC?
It was for the IBC, yes.
Yeah, the International Broadcasting Convention. I think
That's
I
right.
should explain that. Yeah.
Oh,
It's a
right,
trade
okay.
show for the industry.
That's absolutely right. And NHK had this wild idea of having super high vision cameras looking across to London Bridge, not London
Right,
Bridge,
I
Town
see.
Bridge, and so on and so forth. And I produced the effects for them, which is great fun.
What does 22.1 surround? What does it feel like if you're listening to it?
You feel involved in what's going on around you. You've got height as well as left, right, centre,
Yes.
and back, left, right. One of the things we had when we were doing the NHK thing was helicopters flying behind where the microphones were rigged. I had a massive rig stuck up on a balcony. We had helicopters behind, we had aeroplanes flying overhead into Heathrow,
Right.
we had people down on the river, boats going up and down. We had, towards the end of it, they had a sort of a fete of some sort that Town Hall were running, so we could hear people behind us but low down,
I see.
which was quite good fun. So listening to the results, the NHK were brilliant. They brought all the recordings they'd done back to Television Centre and set up a 22.2 setup in one of the studios, and invited those who'd been involved at the Lord Mayor's thing to come and listen to the results of what we'd done. And it was absolutely brilliant, sitting in the middle of all this stuff. I couldn't listen to it properly, obviously, because I was stuck in a little room, but I could monitor individual microphones and listen to pairs of things. So I could check that all the microphones were at least working and going down the line, being encoded in a separate room, and then going across to Amsterdam and being decoded there.
But what about in the room where you're listening to this stuff? How many loudspeakers do you need for 22.1 surround, or 22.2? You said there.
Yeah. Well, if you're doing it properly, you have 22.2.
You do, and the point two is what? Two subwoofers.
That's two subwoofers, yes.
Yeah, I see. I know that super high definition. It's described as, if you stand in front of a screen, it's like looking through a window. Everything is as real as that. So presumably
It's
the
quite
sound
good.
is. Yeah, it's quite good. But that's the Japanese way, isn't it? I mean, they do things
is.
because they can,
That's
not
right.
because they think that necessarily people are going to be able to use it at home.
Yeah, yeah.
But, there's
I
always
mean,
a lag.
their management is very supportive.
Yes, yes.
They don't have to struggle quite like I had to.
No, quite. Okay. Now explain to me how it is that surround sound from the Albert Hall, which is done with this space microphone they have, or some special microphone or other, works with headphones, because headphones only give you two sources of sound, don't they?
They do.
How can you get height and depth?
Well,
Such advanced physics, you don't want to go anywhere near it.
it's quite advanced physics, but basically, if you use what's called a dummy head or an equivalent, you have omni mics either side of a head, if you like, spaced somewhere between 12 and 18 inches apart. You can get that effect. Quite often you have a couple of omni mics stuck against a disc, which is about, I don't know, between 12 and 18 inches in diameter, pointing sideways, if you like, at the stage. And that will give you quite a good surround effect if you listen on headphones. But in actual fact, the surround sound that television produces is done, the rear of it is done with what they call a Hamasaki square, which is 4 figure-of-8 microphones pointed sideways away from the band, the orchestra,
Yes.
so sideways onto the orchestra, but exactly onto the audience and the reverberation in the hall. And you add that to your front mix of the orchestra and soloists and whatever, and that makes a very nice surround sound.
Yeah.
And that you can fold down using the Dolby equipment into a decent stereo, using their app to do it.
Yes, everything has to be downwards compatible to. The lowest common denominator, I suppose, is stereo, isn't it? That's it.
It is these days,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right, Bill. But you were also mixing concerts. I've always been intrigued by that, particularly if you have, a Radio 3 transmission of a prom, say, and you've got television sound as well, because television sound is mixed in a different way, isn't it?
It is, yes, that's right.
Tell me what you do that's different there.
Basically, because it's a visual medium, when you see a close-up of somebody, say, playing a clarinet, if it's just a general wide mix, it's slightly distracting that you don't hear the clarinet quite as close as it's seen. It's somewhere in the mix, if you like. And the subtlety of trying to do it for television is to favour a clarinet for a good reason, not just because the director has decided to cut it up. I mean, they prepare their scores and scripts very carefully, so they know exactly what's happening when. So it's done with reason.
So you have to
generally.
follow a score just as the vision
Yes,
mixer has to follow a score.
that's right.
Effectively.
You basically learn the piece, and take note of where, in actual fact, it's pretty much down to you.
You sort of edge the microphones up so that you don't get a dramatic change.
That's right. It's a subtle.
Yes.
It's a very subtle thing, really. If you get it wrong, if it's too much, it's not nice. So you learn to do it quite subtly.
Now that's
Yes,
interesting. I wonder whether, as costs rise, and people trying to do programs more and more cheaply, whether they then say, "Oh, let's take the Radio 3 sound, and to hell with it, and just do it that way," or whether they always have to have a separate sound mix for television.
for BBC One or BBC Two programs, when I was doing it, they would use our surround sound, television sound. But for BBC Four, they would quite often just go with radio sound. They consider that to be adequate.
Yeah.
We could occasionally persuade the producer that we could do the same, but just give them a surround mix or a stereo mix that was catered for television.
Yes.
So occasionally we were allowed to do our own on BBC Four, but generally it was a radio sound. I don't know what the setup is these days. Obviously, I haven't done it for years.
No, quite. Would you use the same mics for radio as for television, but merely mix it in a different way?
We share microphones. Obviously, BBC Radio go in ahead of us and put up their slings and various spot mics and stuff like that. But if there's a particular need for a particular spot mic on a particular instrument, we tend to go and put our own spots in, which radio are able to pick up if they wish. We're quite happy to share whatever, and basically we work together to try and. It was quite strange when I first started. I was told that relationships between radio and television weren't that wonderful, but that changed. I didn't ever find, well, the very first prom that I ever did, I found it a little strange. The gentleman from radio that I had to work with was a bit sticky, shall we say. But after that, I got on very well with the people that I had to work with from radio. I thought they were great.
Of course, if you take a thing like a concert hall, particularly if you're the Albert Hall and you've got the organ playing and all that sort of thing, I mean, the dynamic range is enormous.
It can be, yes.
You
Yes,
have to
well,
watch it, presumably.
you learn quite quickly, and yes, it can be tricky, and some modern pieces are really particularly tricky. Very modern stuff, but fun to do. You learn, and you learn the scores. You listen to possible recordings of previous. So there's commercial recordings quite often of stuff that you're doing, but you just have to keep in mind that you're doing it for television, and therefore there are parameters that you have to follow, which perhaps radio don't.
Tell me whether are microphones still improving in quality, or have we reached a plateau in terms of quality, do you think?
There's probably still room for improvement. There are some brilliant microphones around, usually quite expensive, which is unfortunate. But even the most mundane of microphones, if they're made with good quality, are terrific. You don't have to go to anything sort of really strange to get a really good coverage of whatever it is you're doing. And the standards, the standard mics that you use on football, rugby, whatever, are still the Sennheiser mics that we used to use way back when. People still tend to use lip mics especially on sport. Not so much these days on the proms. They now have headset mics, which is something that I wanted to have when I was doing proms and was never allowed to have. I thought they were brilliant. When you're doing proms and you've got people up in a box trying to talk over the applause that happens afterwards, they would have to go to either a lip mic or a directional stick mic and talk into it very closely and raise their voices so that they could be heard above everything. And that used to be quite tricky. And then when they came back into vision, you go to the mic that they were wearing on their front and try and do a cross mix without making it obvious. But head mics, you could do it all without them doing all this strange going between microphones and you having to fade up two different mics. But I've never won my case. But they have these days.
Which are in vision and just sort of poking around the corner of your face.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
Did you ever get abroad?
Quite a lot. One of the things I really loved doing was Her Majesty and Prince Philip went off to South Africa to visit, obviously, after independence. We went off to South Africa, the cameraman and I, to be the second part of how the Queen is covered when she's on tour. There's a cameraman who she knows and likes, travels with her in her car, and with the Duke of Edinburgh, obviously. And there's another crew, which was us this time, outside covering her every move as she gets out of the car and goes round and does various bits and pieces. So we followed her around wherever she went. But there was one moment when we actually went with the Duke of Edinburgh to a little village in the middle of nowhere, where there was a school, and he visited the school and generally took interest in what they were doing. So that was really nice.
Any indiscretions you managed to record?
No. But it was a lovely experience, and I got to know Archbishop Tutu rather well because we went and did an interview with him.
I was wondering, are any particular protocols you have to obey when you're with the royal party? What are you allowed to do and what aren't you allowed to do?
Because we're not actually with them, if you like, we're feet away. We're dressed in suits, obviously. We have to dress nicely and behave properly, not like some of the snappers who they are awful. They are one of my pet hates. Snappers for whatever. We did. I felt quite proud of myself, actually. There was one point where she drove up in her Land Rover and got out. She was going to visit a clinic, and she had about 150, 200 yards to walk from the vehicle down to the clinic. And there was a line of snappers supposedly on the pavement, and we were allowed to be on the actual road to do a walk with her as she walked up towards the clinic. And as she arrived and got out, all the snappers got their little aluminium ladders that they tend to go up and take photos off, went into the road behind us. So we were blocked. And I said to the cameraman, "This is going to be a bit rough," I said, "but we're going to go straight backwards and you may have to step rather high over things." And we started off, and I hit the first one quite hard. He went over and he took the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. We had a pile of snappers, and then we stepped quite gingerly over them and did our lovely tracking shot into the clinic. And I was very proud of that moment.
Did the royal party notice?
I think she might have. I do know Prince Philip. I think he may well have had a little smile on his face. Yeah. He's great. I really like him because there was a prom that we did for her birthday, and some of us were introduced to her afterwards up in one of the rooms in the Albert Hall, and he of course was there with her. And when she got to me, the the producer who was introducing us one by one to Her Majesty had forgotten my surname. He said, "Oh, this is Bill. He's a supervisor," and I blurted out something like, "It's a great honour, Your Majesty," but I shouldn't have said anything. And immediately got very embarrassed, and she glided on, and himself came up to me and said, "You say you're a supervisor, young man. Do you supervise this gentleman?" Who pointed to the producer, and I said, "No, sir, it's not like that." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting," and moved on with a big smile on his face. And it was so lovely of him just to lift. He knew that I felt awful for having blurted out this nonsense, but he just lifted the occasion.
So we've heard what you did for the majority of your career. What happened at the end of your BBC career? Because I think you then went on to do a lot of freelance work. Is that right?
Well, first of all, the BBC in its wisdom sold off outside broadcasts to a company called SIS, which was a company that was busy doing coverage of horse racing around the country with commentary, and they'd feed that into all the bookies around the country. And they thought that we would be a very good company to buy, simply because we had all the BBC sports contracts. So they bought us. And we carried on doing stuff for the BBC as if nothing had happened, really.
When you say us, you mean outside broadcast?
Yes.
So that was a buyout of the whole of outside broadcasts by
That's
this
right.
one company that had been serving like turf accountants. Yes.
That's right. Yes.
Golly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So we were doing live television, horses, and well, of course, other sports. Once they had the contracts from the BBC.
Yes.
Before that, the BBC around 1998 was trying to slim down the staff to save money, and they came up with this wheeze of an idea. As far as I was concerned, because I was nearly over 50, I would take early retirement on a reduced pension, go away for 3 months, and then rejoin outside broadcasts on a different contract, which was known as a BBC First contract. And that meant that I would be asked to do 100 days for the BBC as my primary employer, but anything after that 100 days I could go and work for freelance if I wanted to. And so long as I did my 100 days, I could actually do more than 100 days for the BBC if I was asked to, and I agreed to it.
Right.
So I did for a few years after I became a BBC Firster, I didn't bother doing any freelance stuff. And then a lady producer that I'd worked with on Wimbledon, funnily enough, a lot, and other athletics programs and stuff, rang me up and said, "We're doing the very first disabled athletics stuff from Lyon in France. Would you like to come and mix it?" And I said, "Well, yes, I can do, but I've got to set up my own company, so you can pay me." So I set up my own business, and they took me to Lyon, and it carried on from there. So after that, I could actually do freelance stuff as a proper company. I didn't do much, but until SIS lost the contracts for the BBC sports programmes. There were 10 of them, and they only got 2 back, and they decided to fold. So they made us all redundant, and we carried on as freelancers. The very last programme I ever did was the World Athletics Championships at the Olympic Stadium, and that was 2017. I'd sort of decided that it was about time I did retire. I'd already gone past retiring age as far as the BBC was concerned, and I'd done quite a few years on top of that. So the pension was looking healthy, the state pension, that is. So I thought, yeah, if some of the athletes are retiring, Mo Farah was retiring. So
You thought you'd go too.
I thought I'd go together with.
Okay.
So we retired
right.
together, basically.
Right, okay. So that's covered it, really. Thank you very much indeed for doing this. Hope you've
Thank
not
you.
found it too tiresome.
No, not at all.